Mr. Cruel is an unidentified Australian kidnapper who abducted four young girls and did unspeakable things to them in ending the life of the last one, named Carmine Chan. He operated in the late 80s and early 90s before seemingly ending his nefarious activities. His moniker came from an Australian newspaper called The Sun, and his evil crimes have plagued the outback for years, especially since no one has ever been caught. While several suspects were investigated, none were ever positively identified. However, from a dark corner of the internet, on a random Reddit post, one woman claims that her father was Mr. Cruel. Let's talk about it. In 2021, a Redditor going by the name of Corrupted made a shocking post on the Unsolved Mysteries subreddit where she discusses possibly being raised by Mr. Cruel, a truly evil person. The post would go viral and get posted to many other subreddits. Corrupted would answer questions in the comment sections afterwards, but give sparse updates throughout the 3 years since her post. Now, here is the initial post. Hi, fellow Redditors. Not too sure if this even where I should be or even if I should be posting this. It's been on my mind for many decades now, at least 30 years, and it has always terrified me. Although I have no definitive evidence, the coincidences are just too much. To start with, I am only mentioning all of this because I know it's anonymous, and if it wasn't, then there is no way I would even consider mentioning any of this in a public forum. I grew up in an extremely abusive household. My mother displays narcissistic personality disorder. My stepfather is Wolverine, and his oldest son is an alcoholic, a compulsive liar, and is also Wolverine. Sadly, I know this from firsthand experience, and also know that I am not the only person that was afflicted by their attentions. My mother did nothing about the situation. In fact, she often deliberately put me in compromising positions, leaving me in their custody or turning a blind eye when she had undeniable evidence that something had occurred. Although this group is about unsolved murders and not other forms of abuse, this will all make sense as it is all intertwined. When I was about 11 years old, I lived in the state of Tasmania in Australia. My oldest stepbrother had moved interstate to Victoria to join the army, and I was just relieved from the break from his presence. When he completed his basic training, my stepfather and my mother went for a trip to Victoria to watch my stepbrother march out, quote, quote, which is a ceremony at the end of their training to signify that they were now full serving members of the Defense Force. They were gone interstate for approximately a 2 week period. My dates are not 100% accurate, but they were gone from about late August to somewhere mid September. I remember this clearly because once they came home to Tasmania, they had nothing but praise about mainland Australia. Tasmania is an island state, and they wanted to move there. We were packed and ready to move very fast and were gone in just over 2 weeks after the return. We arrived in Melbourne on the 5th of October 1987. Not long after we moved to Melbourne, there was an awful case on the news about a man who was abducting girls from their homes and abusing them. One of his last victims that I was aware of was a young girl named Carmen Chan. Although I was so young at the time and often ignored whatever stories were on the news of a nighttime, this stuck with me because we often ate dinner with the television on at the same time. Whenever something came on the news about Carmen Chan and the abductor that the media had dubbed Mr. Cruel, my stepfather would snap at me and insist that I shut up and keep quiet while he listened. He would turn the television up louder and become very focused on whatever the news was reporting. Mr. Cruel had abducted a few girls leading up to this point and had mostly just assaulted them before he left them somewhere where they would be discovered and returned to their families. In Carmen Chan's case, however, she was never returned and eventually was found deceased. My stepfather's abnormally intense interest in the news surrounding these cases always confused me, as he most certainly did not concern himself with my welfare, and there was plenty of violent news on television for him to absorb. so I had no idea why he was so interested in Mr. Cruel. He did have some other peculiar interests, as he used to have a collection of books printed about serial killers in our home library. I did not read them all as I was too young and really had no interest in the subject at the time, but I remember a book about Jeffrey Dahmer and Ted Bundy, etc. Of course, this is not illegal to possess, on its own not entirely suspicious, but if you combine it with the rest of my post, then perhaps it will appear to be a little dubious? Anyway, it wasn't until I was much older that I started to question as to why my stepfather seemed so interested in Mr. Kroll at the time. That's when I started to read up on what little information the police had on the criminal slash murderer. They believed that he was in the defense force, I think because of the way he was so clean and left behind no evidence or minimal evidence. At the time of these abductions and murders, my stepbrother was in the army, but my stepfather was also a manic neat freak. He would make me wash the hubcaps of the car with a toothbrush when I was cleaning the car, and one day he even went on a meltdown because I left a tiny ink mark on the front page of a newspaper while I was checking to see if a pen was working. His tidiness was a compulsion. The one piece of physical evidence that apparently Mr. Cruel left behind was a whisker, so the police thought that they were looking for a redhead because the whisker was red. Both my stepfather and my stepbrother are brunette unless they grow facial hair. They both have red facial hair. The police thought that their subject was from either Tasmania or New Zealand due to some colloquialism language that the abducted girls heard. I cannot recall the exact phrase that was released to the media. I just know that when I read it at the time, I recognized it as something my stepfather and stepbrother used. They often used colloquialisms such as, "How do you like them apples?" or "How does that grab you?" in a sadistic, condescending tone. This is just a couple of the many they used. Also, at the time of the abductions and abuse slash murder, all the victims were female and all of them were the same age as myself. Lastly, the last coincidence that comes to mind at the time is the timeline. From what I read in the media, they believe that the first abductions from Mr. Cruel occurred sometime in either late August to mid September 1987. I cannot recall the exact date, I just remember how ill it made me feel to know that both my stepfather and my stepbrother were both in Victoria at the time this happened. And the last victim they believe Mr. Cruel abducted was either in September or very early October in 1992. These dates are important because, against my wishes and against my stepfather's wishes, my mother insisted we move back to Tasmania, and we left Victoria on October the 5th, 1992, just after Mr. Cruel's last apparent abduction before he went quiet in Victoria. Around the same time that we have moved back to Tasmania, my stepbrother moved from Victoria to Queensland. So now both my stepfather and stepbrother were no longer in Victoria. Although both of them had been there during the times that Mr. Cruel was active. Both my stepfather and my stepbrother have a sadistic streak, and I honestly believe that after living with them for 13 years, that either one of them was quite capable of doing these acts. My stepbrother, however, a little skittish and anxious when he was being abusive, but my stepfather always kept his composure. At the time that Mr. Cruel was active, we lived in the northern suburbs of Melbourne, which is where Carmen Chin's body was found, and so did my stepbrother. Her body was found only a couple of suburbs away from where we resided. My stepfather does not appear to fit the physical description of Mr. Kroll as he is quite short, but my stepbrother does. It would not even surprise me if they acted if it was them as a pair because each of them knew of the other's fetish sadistic behaviors and each of them covered for each other. At the time that Mr. Kroll was active, I would also like to note that at least one of his victims stated that they could hear airplanes overhead when they were abducted. We lived in the northern suburbs of Melbourne at the time, not too far from an international airport and underneath the flight path of many of the flights. Also, one of the descriptions of a room that one of the girls was kept in matches up from what I can remember from one of my stepbrother's rooms when he was living out of our home for a while. My stepbrother never lived on barracks when we moved to Melbourne. He either rented his own place or he moved back in with us for a while. The only time I recall that he lived on a base was just before we moved back to Tasmania. At this time, he was married and was working as a chef at a communications depot. Because this depot was so small and in a rural area, and because he was married, he was provided a house on the depot site to live in with his wife at the time. Because he was a chef and the depot was so small, he was the only chef that I was aware of, so it was essential that he be available on site to cook breakfast, lunch, and dinners. So living at the depot was pretty essential. I also recall his really odd behavior, which may not have anything to do with this case, but it was not uncommon to find him vacuuming his house or hanging washing out the back to dry at 1 a.m. This may have something to do with him being a chef and working hours that were different than most, just getting household chores done when he could. But he was also an extreme neat freak, and I hated spending time there to keep his wife company because as a 16-year-old, I did not appreciate being woken up to help vacuum or hang washing up so late at night. I mentioned all of this to a police officer years ago. All I can recall was that she was part of the task force at the time. She'd asked me to get back to her, but I had a house fire and lost all her contact details. Since then, I have never been able to locate them again, and I have no idea what her name was. I really don't remember, although I really wish I did. I truly believe that one of them, if not both of them, were involved in this whole Mr. Cruel incident. It terrifies me to think that perhaps their dislike for me or their passion to be sadistic towards myself is possibly why they chose targets that were brunette and of the same age of myself. There is a saying in Australia which is you don't bleep where you eat, which means if you are going to commit a crime, you don't do it in your backyard because it is just too close to your home. So the thought of them lashing out at these young ladies instead of myself is just sickening. Of course, I have no definite proof on me or he would most certainly be in prison as I type this. Obviously, I have nothing to do with them at all anymore. Whenever I was abused, it was either psychological and sadistic, was just impossible to prove to authorities unless there's a non-biased witness, or the abuse never left any marks on my body, which again is pretty difficult to prove. My mother once told me when I was 14 that if I ever went to the police, she would lie, and then she asked who I thought a judge would believe, her or a teenage girl. I was so terrified to go to the authorities because I thought no one would believe me, and then the aftermath would be much worse for me. Since then, I have had my stepbrother charged, and he did end up spending some time in jail for some of the crimes committed against me, although most of them have gone unpunished. I don't hold any malice about that, and impressed that Victorian police were able to put together a case on what information they had and that they were able to charge him at all. This does not alleviate my concerns about the Mr. Cruel cases, though. There are so many coincidences that I find frightening. One, the intense interest in the media coverage of the cases. Two, all the victims being same age and same hair color as myself. Three, living in the approximate areas where he was committing the crimes. Four, the facial hair being the same as the sample found at the crime scene. Five, their colloquialisms that match Mr. Cruel's patterns of speech. Six, the time frames that Mr. Cruel was committing his crimes match the times that both of my family members were in Victoria. Seven, living in the northern suburbs, we live close to the international airport underneath the flight path of airplanes. Eight, my stepfather's compulsion for tidiness and my stepbrother being in the army at the time of Mr. Cruel's active spree. 9. Mr. Cruel's activities seem to cease when both my stepfather and stepbrother move interstate from Victoria. 10. My stepfather's fascination with serial killers. 11. My family coming from Tasmania, as the police believe that Mr. Cruel was either Tasmanian or from New Zealand. This is an awful lot of coincidences concerning one case or one offender. I guess all these coincidences don't really amount to a criminal case, but has left me feeling ill, terrified, and with no one to talk to about this. I did try to mention it to my biological father once a few years ago, but I think he just thought perhaps I was overreacting as he was not aware of the abuse I had endured as a child. I had never told him about any of this. Even when my stepbrother was charged and went to jail, my biological father had no idea why and had no idea my mother was aware, and that his father was also part of it all. I can't shake the horrible feeling that I feel like I was raised by a serial abuser. Well, that one I know is a certainty, and a murderer who had no problem in taking the life of a young girl. I know that either of them are capable of such actions, although if I was asked to choose which one, I thought it would most likely be the physical attributes matched my stepbrother. But the calmness of Mr. Cruel is something that was more often displayed by my stepfather, so I don't really know. But I am very sure that one of them, if not both of them, were involved in this case. I just don't know who to approach, who will take all of this seriously. I also have family of my own now, and I don't want them to hear about any of it. I have to be careful because I don't want to expose my children to these kinds of images, thoughts. Lastly, I would just like to add for those who question as to whether or not my thought processes are about the situation are stable, I had to be psychologically assessed as part of the legal requirements when I had charges pressed against my stepbrother. The courts need to assure that the person making those kinds of allegations are mentally aware of their accusations and that there's no sign of mental illness where they may have misinterpreted a situation, etc. Yes, there are psychological effects. I suffer from PTSD, but honestly, if you knew the true horrors of the home I grew up in, then you would be amazed if anyone can endure such an upbringing and walk out of that home without any emotional baggage. If anyone who reads this knows of a person amongst the Victorian Police Task Force who would be interested in talking with me, I have no problem with this and would appreciate a way to contact them. As I type this, I am sitting here shaking as I recall my old home and what those poor girls had to endure, and poor Carmen, who probably did nothing wrong other than to view his face. My heart goes out to her family, but I am so scared that her family would bear a grudge towards me. Even though I've had nothing to do with the situation and was the same age as their Carmen, grief can make someone view perspectives differently. I would be ashamed to face them unless I was able to assist in them getting some kind of justice. I have not mentioned exact suburbs or exact information, as if this is of interest to the police, I do not want to jeopardize any possible investigation and outcome by posting information publicly before an official investigation is done, nor do I want to cause any possible biased opinions, as this could affect the outcome of a court hearing. I'm not saying that my step family members will ever be charged or go to court or that they are definitely guilty, but I will not take the risk of ruining any chances of possible justice just so I can tell my story on Reddit. Thanks for reading. Perhaps someone will respond with some kind of information or advice. About a year ago, she posted an update where she gave some insights into what was going on. Yeah, I always live with no regrets. I've reached out to the Office of Public Prosecutions to see if they're able to put me in touch with the current task force I need to speak with. I don't live anywhere near my stepfather and cannot get access to anything with his DNA. He lives in an island state and I can never return there because, well, it's not as safe for me as some may assume. I wouldn't say that there is little risk to myself, but I'm still prepared to go ahead with a statement. I have managed to avoid my family for well over a decade now, and if I thought there was a chance they could find me so easily, I would not post here. If any of them read this, they would know who I was straight away. I am pretty sure my stepfather may have read some posts already, as he was always highly interested in anything about the case via the media, but it is unlikely he would reach out to me, even using an alias. Nor do I think he would try to contact me and speak about any of it in person either. He is too cautious to risk that, on the rare and unlikely chance that I could be recording the phone conversation, etc. Anyway, I am actually not making a statement for myself. I was able to escape that situation decades ago now, and making a statement is going to be a walk in the park. I will be drilled with questions about what I remember and will have to relive those moments in my head over and over again for days at a time. A necessary action on the part of the person taking the statement. They need to ensure that no stone is left unturned, but I have through it all before and know what to expect. When I do make this statement, as I have continuously said, not 100% sure my stepfather was involved, but I won't know unless I make a statement and it is able to be used to help close the case. I'm only going to be making the statement because it is a moral obligation. I know what it feels like to feel that you need justice, and if I can help the families and victims, then it would be for their sake, not mine. None of this is going to do anything positive for me or my family, children, other than to help bring attention to a dangerous man. I already know that it is going to be a living hell for me for a while, but in the long run, I will survive it, and the victims and families deserve it. On one hand, I hope I am wrong about the connection to MC, but on the other, it would be good to bring closure to this case no matter how it's done or who does it. Outside of a few replies and some basic Reddit posting, Corrupted has not posted an update in over a year. The identity of Mr. Cruel remains a mystery, and we hope that he comes to justice. What do you think? Was this Redditor onto something? Do you think this was a hoax? Do you believe the post? Tell me in the comments section below. If you are interested in me doing a dedicated video on Mr. Cruel, please let me know. I hope you liked this video. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe here at StudioJake After Dark. Of course, you can support me on my locals community. The link is in the description. And don't forget to ask, what happens when you turn out the lights?